Now, good morning, Colin.
Good morning to you. I'm hoping you. I'm putting it down to the fact that my FTB wasn't on the computer. Yes. I've been trying since 9 o'clock to get through to you.
Well, we're delighted to have you, Colin. We've already introduced you. So, over to you.
Yes. Well, how do we start? Me as a young publisher, having a young newspaper reporter coming to interview a colleague of mine about a book which we were publishing in 1968. In 1969, I took a manuscript that he had written called The Carpet People to the Frankfurt Book Fair. And 50 years, half a century ago, this year, I signed the first overseas translation contract, with a German company called Verlag Sauerländer, and it was published in 1972, a year after we published it in 1971. So that was the start of my attempts at selling him. When I went to Frankfurt, I'm not sure whether you're seeing that or not. Yes, you are.
Thank you.
That is a dummy which we took upon, took to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and showed around to the various publishers. So at the beginning, there was not a lot of interest. Well, Terry wasn't writing very often. He spent most of his summer, he only tended to write during the winter evenings, and during summer evenings he spent gardening. So we then had Dark Side of the Sun and Strata, which took some time to write. Both were taken, the first foreign publishers were German ones. Again, I succeeded in getting interest from there. And I had, of course, American publishers, co-publishers as well for those two books. So let me just see which is the best order to communicate these bits of information. I used a sub-agent for some of the translations. The French language and German were both sub-licensed through Les Poquel, who was a man who, I believe, edited a number of SF magazines, but as well as being a literary agent for the subrights in book translations. I continued to use them and those persons I connected with until we were about to publish The Light Fantastic. And at that time, Terry wanted to go to move to Gollancz, which is I think the best SF publisher in the UK. And so we transferred by a very convenient thing, but I knew the managing director of Gollancz, who was a fisherman, a fly fisherman, and we talked fly fishing, and we also talked transfer of Terry to Gollancz. We did a co-publishing arrangement for three titles, and didn't work really. I didn't feel that they were keeping to the word or the spirits of the contract that we had. And Terry didn't like it either. And so we changed, and I became Terry's agent. That was in 1987. But at that time, what I could say is that Terry was such a remarkable writer. Not just because his imagination was brilliant, but you could point out to him there was a piece in Strata. I said, this does not fit. It needs something to join two scenes together. And I said, well, I needed two sentences from you. You can do that. And he sat down at the typewriter and basically typed out a page and a half of new text, which fitted so seamlessly into what he had written that I do not know where that bit is. And I couldn't find it even within the first, within a week or two. I was totally amazed. And Terry was writing, as you can see from the dates of the publications, not very fast. The evenings were not taking up as much writing time as I would have liked. But then he discovered that when The Colour of Magic sold so well in paperback in Britain that they reprinted the following year, and according to some of the booksellers, he was actually selling better in his second year after publication than he was in the first year. And in our transfer to Gollancz, they said, we will make you a bestseller, and which they did in with Maud. And very soon after that, basically every single one of Terry's books went to #1 bestsellers in Britain. In one case, we had, I think it was Last Continent. It stayed in the #1 bestseller position for 12 weeks. That, I would say, is not necessarily because Terry was such a brilliant writer, but the fact that there was such a poor collection of other books against him. Now, you have asked me, I think, to say how deals with publishers around the world. Some were people who read Terry in English. For example, Laguna, which was the Serbian publisher. There are incidentally 41 languages in which he is now published. I could read them lists out to you, but I don't think you need to do that because it's on my website. But Laguna was an interesting case because here you had somebody called Dejan Papic who got in touch with me and says, I want to publish Terry Pratchett. And I said, so you're a publisher? And he said, no, I'm not a publisher. And I said, well, we don't actually sell to private individuals. You must go and get a publisher. About 10 days later, I get a communication from a firm called Laguna. And Laguna, we made a deal with. Now, that was, I had no idea that Laguna was in fact set up by Mr. Papic, who'd done this without telling me that he was the same person. But in those weeks, he had formed a publishing company. he'd given it a name, given it a logo, and from then on, though I knew it not, he existed solely as a publisher, publishing Terry Pratchett, and the first 8 books that he published were all Terry's, and he obviously had the right route, because 20 years later from that, it's the leading publishing house in Serbia and in the Balkan regions. We have published so far more than 4,000 titles from different groups of target groups. I've also started a bookstore chain 10 years ago, and today it's the leading chain with 42 bookstores and counting. We have a readers club which has over 600,000 members, and that all started from Terry Pratchett's Colour of Magic. The question of translations comes up a lot, because it's humor is at least I'd consider the most difficult thing to translate. If you're writing a biography, translating a biography, straightforward, good, providing you can speak and write properly in your own language, then you can do it. But when it comes to humor, that's difficult. You've got to do that transfer. And when it comes to fantasy, you have an extremely difficult problem, because as we heard yesterday, how do you change a joke into another language without destroying it? The Czechs, for example, publishers by name of Tal Press, sent out a scout basically to say, find me the best translator into Czech that you can find. And he came back and said, I'm terribly sorry, there's nobody in the Czech Republic who can understand the jokes and transfer them into a different culture and make them amusing. And Tal Press said to Jan Kantorek, I think you have talked yourself into a job. And Kantorek then, from the day he started on The Colour of Magic to the day he died, which was fortunately after he had finished Science of Discworld, translated everything for Tal Press, and was amazingly popular. The Czech Republic is the only country where at any one time the adaptations, Stephen Briggs's adaptations, get continuously performed by professional companies. And we have a situation where there are something like 5 or 6 different companies in the Czech Republic continuously performing Terry's plays, or Terry's Briggs plays, we might say. The Colour of Magic was first performed in 2001 in Prague, and it only came off the regular performances of the theatre in Luha Street in 2015. It went through nearly 200 performances. Admittedly, a lot of these performances were filled with Pratchett fans who seemed, I think, to organize block bookings. So the theatre actually took it off because they feared that their performances of Ibsen and other serious individuals were being clouded out, as it were, by the being known as a Pratchett theatre and nothing else, because they also did a masquerade, both of which got put on Czech television 2 or 3 times. And no other country has had such popularity on the stage as the Czech performances. But translations. Our first problem, I mean, we live in Northern Europe, so what could go wrong? We offered the translations. Of course, we didn't realize that the translators were going to change the sex of death, so that we were going to have a female death throughout. This caused not a little embarrassment. Occasions where the printing presses had to be stopped in the middle of a reprint, and sex changes had to be done. More Eastern European publishers were saying, please, can't we, we're only a small publishing company, you know, nobody's going to notice it if we keep death female, as with all the other Romance languages. But we thought, well, you haven't yet translated Reaper Man. Now, with Miss Flitwick and death would be the whole chemistry, should we say, would have been changed. And we have the problem generally in translations that in every contract throughout the world, when it comes to translation, has a clause which says that they must be accurately and faithfully translated. Now that's fine for history, biography, etc., etc., etc. But when it comes to fantasy and humor, as I said before, it's difficult. And so the contract, basically, that particular clause doesn't get, it's a dead letter. And so we have to rely on the fact that the translators are good. Sometimes they aren't. For some reason, the French L'Atlantis published a translation of The Color of Magic, and their reprint was written by a completely different translator, who has then, Patrick Coutan, has done basically all the translating of all the books since the beginning, and had the rather odd experience for a translator that when they published The Shepherd's Crown, they had a major launch in three French cities, Paris, Nantes, and somewhere else, and there the person who was signing the books was Patrick Coutan, and this was something that in a lifetime of translation he had never been in the chair, the signer's chair in the bookshop, which rather delighted him. That was a great thing. Apart from Laguna, the Bulgarians, Jana Vuzeva, set up her company, not as successfully, with nothing else on her list but Pratchett. The early ones, the first of the publishers was probably apart from the Germans, was in fact the Dutch, who published a 2-in-1 of Strata and Dark Side of the Sun. My problem with negotiating for Terry was occasionally difficult. He would not. He had very strong sense of what his books were worth, and he would not accept any advance that was not going to be earned out within 3 years. Others would have gone for such major as much as they could get. But Terry thought he was getting enough, and so that if I negotiated too good a contract, I had to go back on one occasion to Terry to Random House Children's Books and tell the editor, I am terribly sorry, but the figure that I negotiated with you is not acceptable to Terry Pratchett. He won't accept it. And there was a sort of gulp from the other end of the telephone, to which I then, after a suitable sadistic period of time, said, it's too high. He won't accept that money. So I had to take it down to about half of what he what I had been offered for him. Similarly, when it came round to the children's books, not children's books, the short writings of what was it? Yes, it was original short writings which came out years before, or was to have come out years before the ones that we actually finally negotiated with Doubleday. And the figure that Gollancz had offered, compared with the figure that Random House had offered, was considerably higher. And it was in the upper 100,000s. And Terry said, they're mad. They're absolutely mad. They've got an excess of testosterone. I'm not going to accept it. Withdraw the book. And that was a figure of something like $750,000. He said, these books, everything in these books is already been published. There's nothing new. And so it was about 10 years later before they finally came out with Random House. I'm not sure that I need to talk much else about the questions. I know what I will say, that the American editions are often different from the UK editions. This is because he proofread both normally at the same time, and in his determination to ensure that the Americans could understand the jokes or the words or the vocabulary, he did not hesitate to actually edit. There is a section in one of the, probably more than one books. I've only found one. I happen to have read two in Thief of Time, a passage in Thief of Time which is not only just changed for the language, but he's actually completely rewritten a passage. It's in, if you ever look at miscellaneous on my website, it's the second note or something in there. I'm sure there are other places where too he has edited, not just to change boot to trunk and or whatever, but they are they happen, and unless you're going to read both, as I'm sure some academics will do in due course, and they will compare the versions, we won't really know what they are. I think I should take questions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. There's been tons of questions coming in while you were talking. So I'll start by selecting some, and please, everybody, keep writing your questions into the chat. One question is about Discworld, and I suppose the question kind of comes from a point where Discworld originated and blossomed in terms of reception in the 90s. So where do you think the Discworld sits in today's world? Has its relevance sort of changed? Or
well, yes. I mean, they started off as fantasy novels. They became a mirror world, or a mirror of this world, and in things, for example, the idea of nation came to him some time before the tsunami of 2004, but he put it on one side because he could not. He felt that it would be inappropriate for him to do that. There were others like the Only You Can Save Mankind. He had originally planned to write Johnny and the Dead first, but when the Gulf War started, he felt that there was somebody else was going to write a story in the same way that he planned it. So he shifted the order of the books around. Where does he fit today? There are nearly 100 million copies of his books around the world in 41 languages. He has ceased being referred to in newspapers as Terry Pratchett, the British author, or Terry Pratchett is the author. He is just Terry Pratchett. It is now expected that everybody, I think, knows who Terry Pratchett is. And in that, he has influenced people. We used to have in the 80s academics who refused to view his books. The national newspapers refused to review any fantasy or science fiction. They removed them. I mean, it was easy to do them because it was the bestseller lists were basically added up by hand, and so those who did them have publicly stated that no science fiction book will ever appear in the bestseller list, and that in the 80s and the 90s was the general rule. And even when they did appear on in number one, they were ignored. Now, I was at the time that The Truth came out. I was asked by Terry to pick up a copy of The Truth to bring with me to a meeting, and I went into Hatchard's, that eminent bookshop in Piccadilly, and said I want and went. They have a table there which is of bestsellers, and so I went to the bookshop, but no copy of The Truth, and I queried this to a supercilious fat assistant who was standing in front of a wall of Harry Potter books, and I said, I'm wanting The Truth. Why isn't it on the bestseller list table? And they said, oh, well, it's not really a bestseller, is it? And I said, well, it's only been number one in the bestseller list for 4 weeks. Don't you consider that to be a bestseller? So that was the sort of snobbish situation. that one had to live, even up to the time of the truth, which is very annoying. Terry would take it more philosophically and would smooth out the description, my description, so it became more polite, shall we say, when he repeated it. Do I finish that question?
Yes, no, thank you, Colin. As you were talking, I was just thinking there's someone who made a very interesting comment. It wasn't a question, but I think it should be aired because it aligns very neatly to what you were just saying, which is that they were saying the early editions in Germany were often not accompanied, but they were kind of garish advertisements for soup and other things.
Yes, the pyramids. It appeared. This was Herr Heine made plenty of extra revenue by putting these little adverts in the novels. Terry wasn't the only victim of this. But the Maggie soup or whichever it was that they were, all other SF writers that he published were made use of in this way. Not one of them got a penny of the advertising, but it did actually stick in. We'd done a 6-book contract. Terry's advances show you some indication of his improved success. I used to give him about £500 for the book, which was, as he said, enough to just buy him a greenhouse. When we moved to Gollancz, first 3 books, we got £3,000 a book. Ooh, goody. And then they did a contract for 6 books, which Terry rather regretted because it did tie him down, rather. But that was for £50,000 a book, which was a slight improvement. And then after that, the contract went up to £200,000 a book, and then £400,000 a book, and ultimately to over £1 million a book. So these figures reflect how they were selling. How they were selling. One of the books was the fastest selling book in Britain, and I can't remember. I should have looked it up beforehand. On one of the pages of the website, the details are there. Does that finish that question?
Oh, yeah, it was the advertisements in the Heine editions. How you and Terry felt about it?
We couldn't change in the question of the Germans because the contract, the translation contracts were always dealt with by Gollancz, and they'd signed a 6-book contract because we'd signed a 6-book contract, as it were. And therefore, Terry had to grin and bear it for the next 6 books or 5 books after Pyramids. And then, as he swore he'd never do another book for them, he moved to Goldman. But then Heine retired and sold his imprint and an entire list to Goldman, to Random House, much to the annoyance to the German book-selling trade, because it meant that basically they had a monopoly of all SF books in Germany. So the German book trade forced Random House, Goldman, to separate part of that and sell it to somebody else. And they sold it on to a firm called Piper Verlag, and who have, although they only had the earliest books to play with, shall we say, or publish, they've done them as multiple volumes, 2 or 3 or even 4 books in a volume. And this is a habit that is also he is remarkably popular in Russia, for example, and they have made multiples on their sales by the fact of bringing out 2 books together, and then book A and book B would be shared between, say, book A and C, or A and D, if you get me. I can give you, I can, let's see if I can. Sorry, I'm not. Yes, I can. If you excuse me while I just enter a.
If I can squeeze in a relevant question that came in earlier, which is about sales figures, if they are publicly available for his books.
Well, country by country, or we have problems with Gollancz sales figures, because they merely tell us how much money we've earned rather than how many books have been sold. They used to, when they were owned by a different company, we used to get the details. Rob took away, visited me Wednesday, and I was fed up with putting something like half a ton of royalty sheets, storing them away, and he has found a place down in Broadchalk where they are now going to be stored. But basically it was a pile something like about 20 feet high if you put them aside, I think. But they would have been even bigger with Gollancz material, because the Gollancz stopped telling us the numbers or showing us the details, so it was rather annoying. Now, Russia, no. Just excuse me a moment. Take multiple treasures.
There were a number of questions as well around translations.
Yes.
Oh. Yeah, no, while you're doing that, I thought I would just comment on them.
Yes. Now, the Russian, I mean, for example, the Russians would do color magic like fantastic, Mort and Reaper Man, witches and broad and old ladies, small gods and pyramids, men at arms and guards, soul music and a Hogfather, sorcery, Eric, masquerade, carpe jugulum, pyramids and moving pictures, hard and snuff, interesting times, small gods, the Mort, Reaper Man, Hogfather and soul music all in one volume, equal rights, weird sisters, witches, broad and lords and ladies, and another volume, the truth and monstrous regiment, and they each sell. Not, I mean, they sell 3,000 or 4,000 of each, but each year they're constantly reprinting. And we don't. I mean, Gollancz tried it and haven't done so in the last 20 years, I suppose. The Czechs did double volumes, which they got illustrations with Paul Kidby as well. I can't remember anything else on that front. initially.
I presume for sales figures, people have to go to the publishers.
Yes. Sometimes they tell you, sometimes they don't. I mean, the Russians will say, for example, Equal Rights with Sisters, which is broad. They are printing 3,000 copies, which are being published on the 2nd of October 2019. But others are a bit more careful. As a bibliographer of Yeats, I have found that the only way that I have been able to find out details of a book sales of Yeats with the American publishers was the fact that I knew the sales director, and he released the information, but very often they're very coy about such things.
Yeah, yeah.
And like I said, you know, when a book sells 85,000 volumes of poetry, you know, they're quite proud of that, and therefore they feel they can bring it out.
Yeah. I was wondering, Colin, in the book trade, is it unusual or is it quite common to as you did with Terry, to move from being an author's publisher to becoming their agents?
I think possibly. I'm not sure how much Rowling has transmogrified by moving publishers, you know, because the second publisher was set up to suit her. I don't think anybody else has, no. But then I wanted to, I did want to keep, didn't want to let him go. And at least I had the advantage that Terry said to me, that of all the agents in London that I know of, you are the one whom I distrust least. And so therefore I was able to continue on, and you know, it was 50 years, half a century of working with him.
Excellent.
Yeah. And it still goes on. I mean, though I don't do as much as because there aren't any books, but, well, except things like the children's books at the moment. But much of my job is, in fact, making quite sure that overseas publishers don't make mess of cover designs and things like that. Minor things, but basically, you know.
Interesting. And does this continue to this day, Colin?
Oh yes, yes. Because Heine would produce weird things. There is on my website a thing called Heine Horrors, which you've seen.
Yep.
You know what it is. In which so many inappropriate Josh Kirby designs were used on Terry's books. It wasn't just the soup, as it were, did it for him. But then, when they got it wrong, I'd slip into the new contracts that if they made mistakes like this of putting an inappropriate cover design, they would be fined over and above the fee. They'd be fined 2,000 marks, Deutschmark. And believe it or not, one book generated 10,000 Deutschmarks out of incompetent repeats or reprints. Quite apart from the royalty, which was rather unfortunate for Josh Kirby, you know.
Compensating a little for Terry lowering the advances. The advances. So lots of questions about translations. I'd just like to put in a little plug here for Culture Night later this evening, because I will be talking about the collection in Trinity and spent a few minutes talking about the translations. So yes, there are Japanese translations, isn't that right? Korean translations, Colin?
Yes, the Japanese and Chinese, mainland Chinese. This is an interesting situation. The Chinese actually have bought all 41 Discworld novels at once. I mean, no country is has ever bought more than 5 or 6 at a time. But the Chinese, they went out and bought all 41 from both from Gollancz and from Random House. I've got this phone going in the background, but it should stop in due course.
Okay. Yeah. And have they 41 yet? Oh, they're in the middle of it, aren't they?
Not yet. I've seen the cover designs of probably half of them so far. They are scheduled to be published between now and 2022 or 2023.
Very good.
But it's an amazing show of confidence, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, sure, the question about sales figure will come again, but
yes, I don't know. The first one, I know that the first one that they published was The Amazing Morris, and there they sold something like 115,000 copies to start with, which was satisfactory. Not when you consider the size of China, but by comparison with other Chinese publishers who published his works before, they only published 10,000 copies.
Yeah.
So it was a decent.
Hopefully a growing market. Yeah.
Yes.
Someone is wondering.
What worries me, of course, is how good are the translations?
Yes.
Nobody, we have 40 languages. Nobody is multilingual sufficiently to be able to tell us whether they're good translations. We know they're good in certain things like French, German, the Spanish, Czech, and so on. But and I suppose you could say American. But we don't know. We just have to guess. It is worrying. We've no idea.
Colin,
yes.
Yeah, we take that as a challenge. As you know, James works in the Centre for Literary Translation, and Trinity we also have a Centre for Asian Studies. So I think we shall have to put this to a few colleagues in the university.
Well, yes, it will be interesting to see. We know, again on my website, there is a page about translations, titles translated and retranslated literally back from the language to back into English, and they are interesting. I've only done it for a few of the titles, but they are definitely an eye-opener, shall we say. Of course, so many of Terry's titles are perfect in themselves, and again, because of the problem of translation, they would fall flat if they were translated. So the only one I can think of which really irritates me is the German one for Carpe Jugulum. Everybody else used Carpe Jugulum. The Germans said, the Germans won't understand that. We better call it something else. So let us call it Warm Blood.
Huh.
Which reason we do not
know. Sorry, a question just popped out of my mind. Yes, so talking about titles, someone was wondering about how were the titles decided? Was this Terry, or was this sort of in conversation with you and Rob, or the publisher? Titles?
No, I don't think any publishers thought of any titles. Terry would think of them. They occasionally would be changed. Feet of Clay, I think, was originally going to be called Words in the Head, because at the time there was another book going to be coming out with a similar title. So there were occasions where, to avoid a clash, titles were changed. And sometimes there were books which had planned titles, running titles, shall we say, ones which were used throughout the production, and then they'd be given a different title. But they always came out of Terry's head. Oh yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So
I can't think of anything which, when somebody said, "Oh, here's a better one for you," and Terry saying, "Oh yes, it's much better than mine."
Right. Interesting. A little question early on. Someone is wondering about, I'm not sure if I pronounced this correctly, Dunmanifestin Limited.
Dunmanifestin, yes. Why is it called Dunmanifestin? Well, a lot of suburban cottages used to be called Dunromin. When the retirement cottage was called, with this pun, I don't know if you ever wanted to live in a house called Dunromin. You've given up roaming your life, so this was this Dunmanifestin was giving up the idea of manifesting themselves on the earth, on the Discworld. Though of course, when we assume that atheists still get their windows broken if they are a bit too noisy about their atheistic tendencies. And after all, you don't believe in the gods; they exist. You know that they exist.
Yeah.
You
Very
get
good.
your windows broken if you don't, it seems.
Yeah, that's right. And someone again talking about the books early on maybe not being taken entirely seriously. Someone has heard of a commentator talking that Terry Pratchett was obviously for 14-year-old boys, but this then
a conceited person by name of Tom Paulin, who was an academic who didn't like Terry. But
right.
The other thing, we had spotty. I mean, the criticism was that these were spotty teenagers in the 80s. But those individuals have forgotten or didn't realize that these spotty teenagers would become professors of English literature in major universities.
Very good. Well, the participant here was wondering if this changed with the serialization on BBC of Equal Rights. BBC Radio 4 was that a game changer. The audience.
The first Woman's Hour was the first indication they read both Equal Rights and Colour of Magic, which produced more reader reaction, both positive and negative. And indeed, we were very fortunate that Colour of Magic came out at about the same time that Corgi brought it out, and that definitely helped. And then quite a large number of them, are now on audio disc and CDs. And then, well, leading up to, shall we say, Good Omens, which I think in some ways is better than the book. And then we have a thing called The Watch, which I suppose the contract said that Terry had veto on the storylines, but it took a long time before it came it came into fruition. By which time Terry was dead, and so and the contract didn't actually say who was going to say no later. Can I just quiet this damn thing? Hello? Oh, yes. Well, I'm in the middle of a Trinity at the moment. Can I ring you back? Right. Bye.
Right, we're nearly at the end, Colin. I just have one last question, because this person really wants to ask it, which is, would you like to recommend a book to this conference that is not by Terry Pratchett? Do you have a favorite book, a non-Terry Pratchett favorite book to read?
If I do this, you say that you understand why I say I can't.
Right. There are too many.
Well, that's just one room. I've got 2 other rooms full.
Yeah. Okay. We're happy with that answer. Listen, Colin, unless you would like to share any final thoughts to this talk?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, then, on behalf of the conference, I really would like to thank you warmly for your flexibility and your time, and joining despite the technical difficulties.
I could finish off with listing the languages, if you like.
We'll leave that for Culture Night later.
Yeah. So,
yeah,
right.
and I think we still have a long day ahead of us. So I think it deserves a 15-minute break before we continue.
Right. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Right.